we journey throughout different cemeteries in the old Louisiana town of St. Francisville and share with you the untold stories of those who rest there. We will now share with you the cemeteries of St. Francisville. Locust Grove is a small cemetery that has several generations of family buried there. Its main claim to fame is that it is the resting place of Jefferson Davis's first wife. And now to our interview with Miss Ann.
All of the early plantations had their own cemeteries right on the place. And that was the cemetery that was attached to Anna Davis Smith's plantation called Locust Grove. And when her brother, who was Jefferson Davis, came and brought his young bride in 1835, the young bride was Sarah Knox Taylor Davis, and her father became the president, Zachary Taylor, President of the United States. When they came on their honeymoon, they had been married 3 months, and they came to Locust Grove to visit Jefferson Davis's sister, and both of them got yellow fever. And they were in separate rooms, separate bedrooms, quite ill, and Jefferson Davis could hear his little bride singing her favorite song, which I think was Silver Bells. And as he tried to get to her room, she died. She was just 21 years old, and she was buried in the cemetery at Locust Grove. That really is its main claim to fame. That's why it's a state historic site now. There are other interesting early graves there. General Eleazar Ripley, who was a hero of the War of 1812, is buried there. His little daughter, Aurelia, who died in the 1830s, is buried there. Has a very interesting epitaph on her tombstone that says, "Stranger, there these lines be read, mourn for the living, not the dead." It's a pretty little cemetery, and it is owned by the state now and is open for visitors. But it's typical of the early plantation cemeteries where the families started off being buried before there were established church cemeteries in the area.
This church, St. Mary's, here in the community of Winoak, was built in the late 1850s from a donation by Mrs. Sarah Mulford of Retreat Plantation, which is right across Tunica Trace from us here. She donated 5 acres, more or less, to be used as a church for the community, and it was built at that time by plans from Frank Willis, a noted New York architect who designed many of these small country churches. It became an adjunct parish from Grace Episcopal Church in St. Francisville, and it was dedicated by Bishop Leonidas Polk, who was also named the Fighting Bishop of the Confederacy. I believe he gave the first confirmation service here. This church is way out away from St. Francisville, about 14 miles, and the people in this community could not go into St. Francisville every week, or they couldn't get into St. Francisville because the creeks would be high, there would be no bridges, and so this provided them a way to have services. It remained a church until 1949, when it was deconsecrated, because by then everyone was going into St. Francisville to Grace Church. But the community here in Winoak still owns it in the St. Mary's Church and Cemetery Association. It was a place for them to come and worship together and enjoy deep fellowship together. My mother, Miss May Percy DeLoreal, had her grandmother who lived at Retreat Plantation, and she remembered coming here in the early 1920s for wonderful picnics. So it was a great gathering place for the whole community, who would come up and not just worship, but they would eat together, they would have picnics and fairs and great times together. So it was very significant to the community. Around the church itself, there are a number of grave sites. The Tolles family, the Woods, the Percys, the Mulfords actually had their own cemetery that's up the road just a little bit. But there are a number of graves here, some that you can see and some we'll have to uncover one day. But this was very much a community church for just about 100 years. As I said, it was deconsecrated in 1949, and we hope to have some work done on the church soon. It was restored in the 1960s, but that's been 50 years ago, and the roof has some bad damage, and that's the first thing we want to take care of, is put a new roof on, cover the steeple, make sure the brickwork doesn't deteriorate anymore. I think you feel the peace and the presence of a very spiritual significance out here. We hope to have it restored at some point, at least, as I said, to get a new roof on it to make sure it doesn't deteriorate anymore. It has been used for weddings over the years. Young Edward Daniel was baptized here. We hope for things like that to happen in the future. It could hold baptisms, but also other things. We hopefully will have it on the pilgrimage one day, and also maybe art shows, maybe picnics, things like that for the community. Right now it is on a private road here off of Angola Road. The access to it is limited. As you can see, it has suffered from vandalism, people coming in at night and knocking out windows, knocking out the bricks, which is a terrible tragedy because it is such a wonderful place. And you've also seen the birds living here. It's become a home for barn swallows, among others. But we hope to see it used both as a church and repurposed a bit for other events.
Grace Episcopal Church began in 1827 and is the second oldest Episcopal church in Louisiana. Its property is decorated by graceful oaks and ornate monuments. The church itself is memorably beautiful.
My name is Hannah Patterson McDaniel, and alas, I have no tombstone. This beautiful gate was, and this whole cemetery area was put up by my son-in-law, Lorenzo Dow Brewer. Before, poor soul, he was killed when the steamship Princess exploded, along with the other poor souls. Now, the ones who are buried here are some of my precious little grandchildren. For in those days, if babies got yellow fever in the summer, they didn't survive, or pneumonia in the winter. But after my dear son-in-law was killed in the explosion, his house was the beautiful Virginia over on Royal Street, which you may have seen. And what was a mother to do? I took my grieving daughter Maria and her babies. We collected what we could. We couldn't even afford a funeral for my son-in-law. So he is in here, but there's no tombstone either. And we went to New Orleans, bought a boarding house, and ran a boarding house on Camp Street for the rest of my days. For what was a mother to do? She had to take care of her grieving daughter and her babies. But the world was good to us. The judges and the attorneys from West Feliciana, they remembered my son-in-law. And when they came to court, when the Supreme Court was in New Orleans, they would stay with us, and they recommended us to their friends. So I lived to be 90 years old. I worked every day of my life, and I did pull my oar. But when I died, there was no one left to bury me. But because I had lived in happier days in West Feliciana, my last request was that my remains be brought up the river. And they were brought up the river by another steamship. And the rector of Grace Church brought a carriage down to the river and brought my remains up to this lot, and this was where I was buried, but there's no tombstone.
Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. My poor wife had these words inscribed on her tombstone. I suppose they are more for herself than for me. In 1850, I was 63 years old and debt-ridden. My name is Levi Blunt. I came from Beaufort County, North Carolina, from a rather prominent family, some of whom were known for perhaps the wrong reasons which may have had something to do with my departure. In Feliciana, I associated myself with members of the Fort family, whom I had known in North Carolina. I became very helpful to the widowed Ann Fort in managing her affairs. This led me to overseeing as a means of obtaining my own planting operation. I was modestly successful until I ventured into raising sugarcane, taking my example from my dear friend William Ruffin Barrow of Greenwood Plantation, but lacking his enormous resources, I bought on credit a costly sugar mill and found I couldn't pay for it. I could not see how I would save myself from foreclosure. I took the one sure way out. I hung myself from an oak tree in our front yard, and there Lavinia found me. Before selling everything to pay my debts, she buried me next to our little son. Later, she had our remains removed here to Grace Churchyard. I suspect that was only fitting. I had been a member of the vestry when the church was organized in 1827, and Lavinia was a lifelong Anglican as well.
We came to St. Francisville, my sisters Anne, Theodosia, Amanda, and I, Lavinia Calder, to teach in the Society Hill Academy for a Baptist missionary named James A. Ranaldson, who had to give up preaching for teaching in order to support his family. We were New England blue stockings, bred and born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, in the shadow of Bunker Hill. After Mr. Ranaldson left, we had our own Society Hill Seminary for young ladies throughout the 1820s. We taught many more subjects than Mrs. Audubon was able to teach, for we had a sound classical education. We offered the young ladies languages, literature, geography, and we gave lessons in painting, sewing, and music. The best of the plantation families sent their girls to us to become accomplished young ladies. In 1836, I surprised my sisters, and perhaps myself, by marrying a widower named Levi Blunt, who had a small plantation on Little Bayou Sarah Creek. My sisters moved to Woodville and taught in a one-room log house. In 1850, my husband died by his own hand. I then, with my 4 daughters, joined my sisters in Woodville, where I died an old lady, with hardly anybody left to remember what I had done with my life. I had written on my tombstone the words I lived by. I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand and keep thee.
My father was Daniel Smith Lewis, rector of Grace Church for 27 years, and I was his eldest son named James Flower, but called Jimmy. Father was the rector who led the congregation to build the present church, but that was after my time here on earth. Father came here in 1838 and wanted every soul on earth to hear the word of God. He preached it to his parishioners and also their slaves, baptizing them and teaching them the catechism. In 1853 came the terrible yellow fever epidemic, and many people left the parish during that sickly season, but Father had his flock to tend, and we thought we had become acclimated. Many people didn't know much about Yellow Jack, except that you could be fine at breakfast and dead before dinner. Many people thought that the fever came from the swamp and rose up into a cloud that settled in the hills. People didn't know it came from a mosquito. That terrible fall, Father buried the 181 people who died through August and the end of November. 20 of them here in Grace Churchyard, for I was one of them, for I died on All Saints' Day. I can only imagine my father's terrible grief as he tenderly committed my body to the grave and my soul to heaven.
My mama and my papa called me our pet, but my real name is Marie Collins Cedric. I was born in Lafourche, Louisiana in 1850. Lafourche was my mama's home, but my papa was a doctor, and he wanted to move to the hills of West Feliciana. So he bought a plantation called Ambrosia, after the man who owned it a long time ago. Papa thought the hills of Feliciana would be much healthier than the marshes of Lafourche, but that did not prove so to me. I died of diphtheria when I was only 10 years old. My poor papa was so distraught He said he would never practice medicine again. He wrote this poem on my tombstone. Rest, gentle one, in hope and faith, to thee was kindly given, to dream life's morning dream, but wake to light in heaven. There rest in peace, nor thee bear earth's tears of grief or sighs of care. My mama said I was not dead, but gone before.
The church was built in 1871 at this very spot here. And it was a school for the church, and it was a large building. They didn't have any graves around here. Everybody was buried over at the Clover Hill, which is now Camp Meridale. That's where they was having church between two banks in the woods. And Miss Barrow from Alphaville was concerned about the slaves because they couldn't read and write. And she talked to her husband, David Barrow, about donating this piece of land here for them. And they built the church, and she donated hearse with black drapes, curtains in the hearse. The hall it did. It was sitting right there. On the other side, that's where they kept the hearse. When somebody died, they would take the hearse and hitch it up with the mules and go get the body and bring it back to the church. And then they would have a wake at night. They would wake them all night, serve coffee, and the next day they would have the funeral and burial. And she donated an organist. And when Alphaville started, they were well trained with music because Granddad Alston, Mr. Barron used to have a man come from New Orleans, a big band they would sing with. Robert Mars was the name of his band, and it would have big dances around there. And they already could sing by blues, sing the blues and everything. So Miss Barrow was concerned about them going to church and learning how to read and write, and that's when she donated this land to build a church. She donated them an organist, and they were already trained to sing, and it was strange enough, a girl was in the book, one that could play the organist. Her name was Georgia White. And she played the organist for them. They didn't have a choir. The choir was organized here in 1932 when the choir was organized here. But they already was trained to sing because they had learned how to sing with that big band out of New Orleans. Would come and they have big dances for them. And they would sing here. And she donated a safe. The only thing left is a safe. We still have that in the church. Have the baptized before they build the baptized they have a pool over on the other side where they baptized now, but we go to different people's pond, the Alphaville pond and the Nolans and up here to K Tower, and everybody would be in white, singing, going to the pond to get baptized.
This cemetery was founded roughly by the founders of Temple Sinai Synagogue, which is by grandmother's buttons in the town. They are now in the process of renovating the synagogue and restoring it to its original structure and features. In this cemetery we have most of the Jews who were raised in this, not raised here, but moved here. Most of the Jews came here from Germany, basically the same area of Germany, and they were in some ways kin or knew each other when they came here. I should also point out that the last person buried here was my mother, and her grave is right behind me. We also have two Baptists in this cemetery. They were formerly of the Jewish religion. They married outside the religion to Baptists. They converted to Baptists, but at the time of their death, they wanted to be buried back here in St. Francisville, and so therefore they were buried here in the Jewish cemetery. Jewish community, any town, the Jews are buried east to west.
Why?
Most of the time they're buried facing the east. Why? I don't know. Also, because of the religion, Jews are buried roughly within 24 hours of their death. They're also buried in a wooden casket, no metal. Only the nails hold the casket together. They're buried in wooden caskets, and they're buried in what's called a burial shawl. In other words, all it is a white satin or white linen gown. And that's it. No fancy suits with high class or anything, or no fancy dress. They're buried in a white shroud, regardless of their sex.
John Jones Austin was born on March 18, 1775. He was a planter, soldier, politician, and served as a first lieutenant in the War of 1812. When he died, he was buried with his second wife, Sarah Palmer, and only one of his 13 children, Miranda Elizabeth Austin.
That he had drowned bringing a cow back from across the creek. And I guess this was one of the stories that Mama told us, so we wouldn't, because we used to get on the horse and ride up and down the creek, and when we'd come back all messed up, and we'd tell her that we had bogged down in the creek, you know. And but this guy also, and when he was like a messenger, because they didn't have any way to get the messages of what was going on in the War of 1812 in New Orleans, and he would come back and forth and be like a carrier of the news, and not, you know, that I guess, and to come home and see his family too. But that was one of his jobs, was to deliver how the war was going. And I just realized just here in the last, when we got our new tags now, that, you know, that was when Louisiana was first, when they won the War of 1812. You know, that was when there was really, Louisiana was first started, from 1812 on forward.
St. John's Church on Laurel Hill was completed in 1874. It was built in memory of Susie Walsh, age 14. Being the only daughter of Colonel V.D. Walsh, he built the church so during services he could look out the window and see Susie's grave.
But let me tell you, what they would do, they were going to move the church. And, you know, we were like, say, first grade. No, yeah, we weren't even, well, we were, because I remember when the guy came and would pick us up, and they had big piles of gravel in the road that, you know, they built a bridge and fixed it. And so that was saying 46, yeah, 46, that they were going to move the church, that the word got out. They were going to move the church. So we started then having Sunday school here every Sunday. And then on the third Sundays, they would come up and have communion. And somehow along in that period when some of the ministers, they didn't want to have us having the Sunday school here and wanted us to come back to St. Francisville. But I could say Cousin Teddy Martin and Aunt Mabel were the ones that kept the church from being moved originally. Not, you know, in the 40s when they were going to move it.
At the cross, where I first saw the light, and the burdens of my heart roll away, roll away. It was there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all my days.